Layla had finally realized that Matthew was very powerful. But she didn't think her father would let her be humiliated. In Layla's eyes, Thomas was a top businessman and a great father. Not many people dared say anything to him. But he had just turned against her, and it was all because of Jasmine. "Why haven't you apologized yet?" Thomas demanded. "You're bringing shame on the family." Layla was young, so Thomas knew she didn't understand the reasons behind his instructions. But he was a businessman, so he knew how powerful Matthew was. If he got dragged into such a mess because of Layla, it would be a big deal for him. Layla looked terrified, but she knew what her father wanted her to do. So she turned to Matthew. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Matthew looked back at her and raised an eyebrow. "Why are you apologizing to me?" Layla didn't react for a moment, but then she turned to Jasmine. "Jasmine, I'm sorry," she said. "It's all my fault. I hope you can forgive me." Her voice was unusually quiet, and although she was apologizing, her tone was filled with scorn. She seemed to be suggesting that she didn't think Jasmine could do anything to her. Matthew shook his head and snorted. "Is that your apology?" he asked. "It's not much of one, is it?" Thomas scowled and gestured toward Layla. "Apologize properly," he shouted. "Think about your attitude and make a better job of it this time." Layla felt helpless. She was usually very arrogant and domineering, so the experience of being forced to do something made resentment rise up in her. She pushed Thomas's hand away. "Who do you think you are?" she yelled. "What right do you have to make me apologize? All I did was post something online, and the post has already been deleted. I've also apologized, so what else do you want me to do? I've done enough. Jasmine, are you going to forgive me or not?" Layla's complete lack of remorse had started to make Jasmine feel bitter toward her. If Layla had apologized properly, Jasmine thought she could just let it go and pretend nothing had happened. But Layla's attitude was infuriating. "Do you really think you've done enough to make amends?" Matthew asked Layla. "You've caused a lot of trouble for Jasmine, but you think you only need to give her a half-hearted apology and everything will be forgotten. Maybe I should buy your father's company and see what damage I can do." Thomas gaped at him. He knew Matthew wasn't joking and could easily destroy the company if he wanted to. Losing his temper, he grabbed Layla's arm, forcing her to look at him as he glared at her. Layla was petrified, and she looked at her father with a puzzled expression. It was hard for her to imagine why he would act in such a way toward her. Her instinct that Matthew really was someone she couldn't afford to offend became even stronger. She looked at Thomas nervously, and her whole body started to tremble. Thomas was an important man in Portland, and most of the people at the university knew who he was. He was acutely embarrassed that everyone could see his fight with his daughter, but he knew he couldn't relent. After all, he knew Matthew could make Phil Dawes work for him, and could also make Estelle Bryant give out a loan of $1 billion. The idea of Matthew having so much power terrified Thomas. Matthew was clearly a complex individual, so Thomas knew he couldn't possibly withstand his wrath. The fact that Matthew had merely asked Layla to apologize and hadn't directly made a move on Thomas was already the best result he could have hoped for. Jasmine looked a little fearful as she watched the tension between Layla and Thomas, and she frowned slightly. She didn't really know what kind of person Layla's father was, but she had heard from her classmates that Layla came from a wealthy and successful background. Thomas certainly seemed to be a rich man, and he was clearly powerful and influential. And yet he had turned on his own daughter in front of everyone. Jasmine was surprised and even a little scared. Her face turned pale, and she was even more shocked by Thomas's next actions. Thomas grabbed Layla and tugged her forward, making her stand directly in front of Matthew and Jasmine. All the color drained from Layla's face. Jasmine couldn't hold her emotions in anymore, and she gently tugged on Matthew's sleeve. "Maybe we should just forget about everything that has happened," she suggested. Matthew still wanted to protect Jasmine, but he also respected her opinion. He was silent for a moment as he looked at Thomas and Layla with contempt. "Remember to behave yourselves in the future," he warned them. "Next time, I might not be so generous." With that, he turned around and left with Jasmine. After they had gone, the color returned to Layla's face, and she grew furious again. "Why did you do that?" she asked her father. "Why do you think we need to be afraid of him? Your company generates hundreds of millions of dollars a year, so he can't be a threat to you." Thomas's brow drew down in a scowl. "Do you think a few $100 million a year is a lot?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Let me tell you why I should be afraid of him. He can easily limit the financing opportunities for the Moore Investment Group, and then the company will be in ruins. Now do you understand what kind of person you've provoked, and why I'm afraid of him?" As he spoke, Thomas could feel his heart beating very fast. As Layla listened to Thomas's explanation, a disbelieving look appeared on her face. She was really surprised, and she had a lot of questions. But because she was so stunned, she couldn't express any of them. "Think about it," Thomas said. "Even the president of your university forfeited 30% of the shares. That's how afraid he was. Plus, Matthew can contact Phil, Estelle, and anyone else in the whole of Portland. All the top figures came here just for Jasmine. If he was able to get all these prestigious people to gather here just because of this small issue, can you imagine the consequences if we really offended him?" His expression was very somber, and Layla finally let go of her anger as the magnitude of her mistake began to sink in. She knew without a doubt that her actions could easily have brought harm to her and her family. The fact Matthew hadn't actually attacked her was a good outcome, but she still felt a lingering sense of fear. She looked at her father in surprise. "Dad, do you think he's really going to let us go?" she asked. Or is he going to wait and attack us when we least expect it? She was very worried Matthew wouldn't let the matter drop, and that his threats had been serious. Thomas just shook his head, looking a little uncomfortable. Do you think that someone with his strength needs to rely on a sneak attack? He asked. Since he said he'll let us go, he shouldn't make any trouble. But if he really wanted to cause a problem for us, we would have no chance to fight back. His expression was very serious, but he was also curious. He knew all about Matthew. Matthew was legendary, and the rumors said he was the second most useless person in Portland. So there was no way Thomas wouldn't know about him. But in just a few short months, Matthew seemed to have suddenly risen in status. No one could stop the young man, and he had already trampled on several families. That was why Thomas was so afraid of him. Layla felt a strange emotion wash over her. That was the first time she had seen someone remain so calm in front of her father, and she had never seen Thomas afraid of anything before. After all, her father was usually the most important person in the room. Layla had listened to everything Thomas had said about Matthew, but she also had a few thoughts of her own. She decided that if she could marry Matthew one day, then she would hold a very powerful position in Portland. Thomas studied Layla very closely, and when he saw her red cheeks, he realized she was thinking about Matthew. He already has a wife, Thomas reminded her. So you'd better not get any ideas about him. Don't get yourself into any more trouble, because if you do, I can't help you. So what if he already has a wife? Layla replied with a shrug. Divorce is always an option. Even though the Moore family wasn't one of the top families in Portland, Layla had a few good friends in the city, and some of them were very influential. After having experienced Matthew's terrifying power, Layla believed she had fallen in love with him. But she wasn't sure if it was the man himself she liked, or the grand status he could give her. She knew her father had a lot of money, but what she really wanted was to be someone special. As far as she was concerned, only Matthew could give her that kind of power. So she didn't want to give up on such a good opportunity. She had found someone to investigate Matthew and Jasmine, and that person had discovered they had a very straightforward relationship. It seemed Jasmine's father and Matthew were just regular friends, and that was why Matthew had helped Jasmine. But Layla didn't believe it. To her, the simplest and most obvious reason a man would help a woman was because he liked her. She couldn't think of any other reason Matthew would have gone to so much trouble to help someone as insignificant as Jasmine. Although Matthew was already married, the fact he had helped Jasmine showed his marriage wasn't stable. But maybe he simply didn't want to be on his own. Layla thought that meant she was in with a chance. After all, she thought she was prettier and better suited to Matthew than Jasmine was. If Layla was willing to put the effort in and charm him, she thought Matthew would easily be drawn to her. She decided to contact her friends from the top families in Portland and see if they could provide any more information about Matthew. A little later, Layla went to a fancy restaurant to meet a friend from one of the top families in Portland. "Zara, what do you know about the second most useless person in Portland?" Layla asked, cutting a piece of the rare and tender beef on her plate. "I want to know more about him." Unlike Layla, Zara wasn't from a successful family in the business world, but the two families did have some small commercial connections. For such people, more friends meant more options, so the two of them worked hard to maintain a good relationship on the surface. But in fact, everyone knew deep down that Zara didn't think highly of Layla. Layla thought her meat was a little rarer than she would like, and she wasn't sure if she was enjoying it, but she didn't say anything out loud. Instead, she smiled at Zara. "Why are you asking about Matthew Ford?" Zara asked with a slight frown. "Don't tell me you're interested in him. He's already married, and he's protective of his wife. There were a few families who were stupid enough to insult her, and he destroyed them straight away. It's better if you don't get any ideas. Otherwise, you'll only get yourself into trouble." Zara smiled at Layla, but her eyes were filled with doubt. She wondered how Layla knew Matthew, and how long she had known him for. She also wondered if Layla knew that Caitlin was pursuing Matthew. If Layla really intended to compete with Caitlin for Matthew's attention, then she was taking an enormous risk. After Jasmine went back inside the university, Matthew returned to his car. He placed the mineral water he had been carrying on the hood and began patting his pockets, searching for the keys. When he eventually found them, he walked around the vehicle to open the door, forgetting all about the bottle of water. As he got in, an alluring young woman wearing thick makeup sidled up to the car. She had noticed the sleek luxury car and had assumed the owner was rich. Casually picking up the mineral water from the hood, she took a sip, and then she made her way to the passenger's side of the car and got in. Matthew looked at her in surprise as he said, "I'm sorry, can I help you?" The woman turned to face Matthew, a sultry smile on her lips. "Let's skip the pretense, shall we?" she asked, leaning closer to him. "But first, let's go and get something to eat." Matthew frowned, confused by what was happening. "I think you may have misunderstood," he said, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I'm just here to see a friend." "Maybe I can be your friend?" the young woman asked, seductively raising an eyebrow. Matthew swallowed hard, but he remained silent, not sure how to respond. "Come now," she said, almost purring. "There's no need to be embarrassed. Why are you being so coy?" She smiled, showing a perfect row of shiny white teeth. "I'm very reasonable with my prices." Matthew was extremely perplexed by the woman. It was evident she must be one of the rich young women from the university, so he couldn't understand why she was behaving in such a way. He smiled at her awkwardly and said, "I rented this car. and I don't have any money." The young woman's flirtatious manner immediately morphed into embarrassment, and she leaned away from him. "If you don't have any money," she said, mild irritation filling her voice, "then why did you put your mineral water on the hood?" "I just sat it there while I was looking for my keys," Matthew replied, shrugging. "And then I completely forgot about it. Shouldn't I have done that?" It suddenly dawned on him that it must be a secret way for people to announce they were looking for someone to fulfill their needs in exchange for money. He realized there were many people in the world who offered such a service, but he hadn't expected the rich young woman to be one of them. For a moment, he wondered whether she had always had a rebellious streak, or whether it was simply the easy dollars that had drawn her into such a world. While he was thinking about it, the young woman flung open the door and got out, slamming the door shut behind her. Matthew got out too and stood there, watching her. "Why are you pretending to be rich if you don't have any money?" she asked, crossing her arms firmly across her chest. Just then, a car pulled up beside them. The young man inside was extremely handsome, and he honked his horn to attract the young woman's attention. He stuck his head out of the window and asked, "Hey, pretty lady, why don't you come and take a ride with me?" An attractive young man called Luke Hamilton walked up behind the young woman. When the young man in the car noticed Luke, his expression turned fearful, and he quickly started the engine and drove away. Matthew's attention was still trained on the newest arrival. He could see by the man's clothes that he was wealthy, and he dreaded to think how much his outfit had cost. Luke looked at the young woman, a deep frown creasing his brow. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the woman and Matthew. "I saw you get out of this guy's car just now. Is there something you want to tell me?" Luke was a very rich man, and although his relationship with the young woman was incredibly superficial and normally involved the exchange of money, he was surprised at how disgruntled he felt to see her getting out of somebody else's car. The young woman's face flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't expected to be caught, but Luke was standing in front of her demanding an explanation, and she felt a little frightened. Luke cast his eyes over Matthew in his scruffy clothes, and decided that he was the type of man who would get swallowed up in a crowd. There was nothing to differentiate him from any other ordinary person on the planet. Amid the awkward silence, the young woman suddenly stumbled forward slightly as a student bumped into her. The student had his nose stuck in a book and wasn't focusing on where he was walking. "Ouch!" the young woman said, glaring at him. The man's book fluttered to the floor, and he bent to pick it up, muttering an apology. "I'm so sorry," he said again, standing back up and giving her a cursory look. Annoyance flashed across Luke's features. His anger had already been ignited by the woman's behavior, and the young man's idiocy was only fanning the flames. "Are you blind?" Luke shouted. "Didn't you see there was someone in front of you?" "I'm sorry," the young man said again, holding his hands up in mock surrender. He took a few steps back and then turned to walk away. But Luke wasn't in the mood to let him off lightly, so he followed him, knocking the book from his hand. Then he leaned in close to the man. "You bumped into my woman," he said, his voice almost a snarl. "I think you owe me an apology." The young man cleared his throat. "Look," he said, "I'm really sorry. It was an accident." It was silent for a moment, as Luke considered what to say next. But Matthew was busy watching the young man. He noticed a seriousness behind the man's expression, a wisdom in his eyes, and he knew the young man was no ordinary person. "No," Luke retorted. "That's not good enough." By that point, a crowd had started to form, intrigued by the commotion, and Matthew could hear their faint whispers of curiosity. What's going on? Is this kid really trying to provoke Luke? Doesn't he know he belongs to one of Portland's most powerful families? He's taking a chance on his luck by offending him. The young man looked at Luke indifferently. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, sighing. Luke screwed up his nose as he thought for a moment. "I want you to hit me," he said triumphantly, a broad smile spreading across his face. "If you have the guts to hit me, then you're free to go." "What?" the young man asked, surprised. "I'm not going to hit you. I have no problem with you. And I already said I'm sorry for bumping into your friend. Can't we just leave it at that?" Luke's expression turned icy, and his eyes grew dark. "You're a real idiot. Do you know that?" Luke glared at him. "There are some things a book and intense studying can't teach you. It's no wonder some people don't bother going to university." His heart was beating rapidly as adrenaline coursed through his body. "I told you to hit me," he said, his face growing hot. "And you still haven't done it. Are you a coward?" The crowd continued their muttering. In their opinion, the young man really was being a coward, and they felt a little embarrassed for him. "I have no reason to hit you," the young man said calmly. "Just let me go, and we can both go about our day." Luke inhaled deeply and let out a long, slow breath. Feeling calmer, he said, "I'll give you two options to free yourself. We either fight it out here and now, or you can get on your knees." The young woman gaped at Luke in shock. Did he really just suggest this man get on his knees? She thought. Surely he can't make him do that. The crowd gave an audible gasp, as they too were flabbergasted by Luke's audacity. They discussed it among themselves. Surely he's gone too far now. It doesn't take a genius to work out that a full-blown fight could end with someone getting badly hurt. They are both really bold requests. I'm not sure I could bear to watch either way. You can't bear to watch? How do you think the poor guy's going to feel having to choose? To everyone's astonishment, the young man quietly and calmly kneeled on the ground and stared up at Luke. Another audible gasp rang out among the crowd.
Luke smiled down at the man triumphantly. He couldn't believe the man had chosen the coward's way out. "Interesting," he said with a chuckle. "I hadn't expected you to be such a wimp." Everyone continued watching, their mouths agape. Matthew, on the other hand, had a faint smile playing about his lips. He knew there was no real reason for the man to humiliate himself in such a way, and he suspected the man was playing a far more calculated game than Luke. "He's not a wimp," Matthew said under his breath. One of the nearby crowd members heard Matthew's comment and snorted. "You don't think he's being a coward?" the man asked. "He's being bullied, and yet he's just taking it and being made to look a fool." But Matthew was wrapped up in his thoughts, so he wasn't listening. He was certain that the only way a person would endure such humiliation was because they were more astute than anyone was giving them credit for. Moreover, the way the man was gazing up at Luke with an indifferent expression was making Matthew feel a little uneasy. The man hadn't moved his eyes from Luke's face since the moment he had kneeled on the ground, and there wasn't even a trace of shame on his features. "Who is this guy?" Matthew thought. He could see that the man's eyes held an ambition unseen in any ordinary person's eyes, or at least not among anyone he had seen in the mortal world. Suddenly, the man stood up, his expression blank. Then he simply walked back over to his book and picked it up, returning to his studies without a second glance at Luke or the surrounding crowd. Luke watched the man, feeling equally shocked and furious. He visibly deflated, not feeling even the slightest bit of pleasure from taking revenge. He knew he couldn't let the matter drop so easily, and his anger boiled over. "Hey!" he yelled. "I didn't say you could get up. I told you to kneel before me, but I didn't say for how long. Get back on your knees. Otherwise, there'll be hell to pay." Matthew's brow creased, and he shook his head, concerned that something terrible might be about to happen. The young man's eyes turned dark, and they flashed with an impending doom that caused the onlookers to tremble with fear. Even the air around him seemed to cool, and Matthew knew beyond doubt that the man was capable of something extraordinary. Deciding to intervene, he rushed forward. "Enough!" he shouted, reaching Luke's side. Luke frowned at Matthew, and when he spoke, his tone was icy. "You want to help this guy?" "No," Matthew said flatly. "I'm helping you." Luke was confused, unsure why Matthew had stopped him. Ideally, he wanted to hurt Matthew for being with his woman, but something didn't feel right, so he didn't dare attack him without knowing what was really going on. The Hamilton family was known to be one of Portland's most powerful families, but there were still many people more formidable than them, and he knew the danger of provoking someone he shouldn't. Luke silently considered his options before grabbing the young woman's arm and pulling her away. The young man merely began to flip back through his book, ignoring everything else. The crowd mumbled their shock at the man's lack of awareness. Incredible, He hasn't even thanked him. I know. If it hadn't been for that man, who knows what kind of punishment he would have had to suffer. The young man tuned out the chatter of the crowd, knowing he didn't owe Matthew anything. After all, he knew Matthew had been telling the truth when he had put a halt to the argument. It was Luke he had been trying to protect, not him. With nothing left to stop him, the young man was finally free to walk away, and the crowd began to disperse. Matthew watched the retreating figure of the young man, completely mystified by his character. Just what kind of person is he? He wondered. He thought he had detected similar abilities to himself in the man, so he knew there was more to him than met the eye. It seemed the people of the mortal realm could be far more complicated than he had imagined. As Luke dragged the young woman away, she carried with her a trace of resentment. She hadn't understood why Luke had let the pretentious guy with a rented car off the hook. "Why didn't you stand up for me and teach that guy a lesson?" she asked, annoyance peppering every word. She had known Luke for a long time, and although he would call her his woman, she wasn't really his girlfriend. Those two things were very different concepts, and Luke had never tried to take things further with her. He always appeared indifferent, and she wondered if she would have even seen him that day if he hadn't seen her get out of Matthew's car. Luke couldn't look at the young woman, fearing she would see his embarrassment. He wasn't prepared to admit that when he had faced Matthew, he had felt a sense of fear. He didn't know what had elicited such fear. All he knew was that he had felt the need to escape. Knowing he had to say something, he meekly said, "I'll teach him a lesson when I have the time." In a quiet, secluded clubhouse, Layla cowered in a darkened corner of the room. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she hugged her knees tight to her chest. Standing directly in front of her was the imposing figure of Caitlin Harvey, who was staring down at her, her expression one of utter disdain. Caitlin had been informed of Layla's interest in Matthew, and it did not sit comfortably with her, since Caitlin had been in love with Matthew for a very long time. "I told you as soon as I could," Zara said, stepping forward from the shadows. Layla was horrified to see that Zara was behind what was happening. She had eaten a meal with Zara recently, and she was finding it hard to process that her friend could have betrayed her so easily. "She told me she liked Matthew," Zara continued, "and she even asked if I had any contact information for him. Of course, I didn't provide her with any, and immediately notified you instead." Zara looked at Caitlin with a mix of respect and self-satisfaction. Caitlin remained silent as she slowly crouched down to Layla's level. Her face was very close to Layla's, and she could feel the fear emanating from the woman like a force field. She thought Layla looked vulnerable as she huddled in the corner, and she was taking great pleasure in lording her power over the young woman. Layla swallowed hard. She didn't know why Caitlin was so angry with her, or where it was leading, and she was finding it harder and harder to hide her distress. She knew who Caitlin was, and she was aware of her status in Portland. No ordinary person could compare with such a high-powered woman. Even if Layla's father knew her fate was in Caitlin's hands, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Caitlin tipped her head to the side slightly, as if she were trying to look at Layla from a new perspective. Then her eyes grew dark and menacing. "How dare someone like you try to chase after Matthew?" Caitlin said, her voice low. "What gives you the right?" Layla dropped her gaze to the floor, but Caitlin reached forward and grabbed her chin to turn her face toward her own. "Don't look away from me when I'm speaking to you," Caitlin snapped. Tears sprung to Layla's eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was because of the pain or from fear. "I don't know what I've done," she said awkwardly. "You don't know what you've done?" Zara repeated incredulously. "Caitlin is a good friend of Matthew's, and she's liked him for a very long time. She's been biding her time and working her way into his confidence. It's only a matter of time before he can no longer resist. She's not about to let you, or anyone else for that matter, step in and ruin that for her." After hearing Zara's explanation, everything slipped seamlessly into place, and Layla finally understood what was going on. She wished she had never told Zara that she liked Matthew, but she would never have guessed that such a flippant comment could get her into so much trouble. The commotion in the corner was beginning to draw some attention from the few guests in the clubhouse. The rich kids swiveled in their seats and peered over their friends' shoulders to try to get a better look. But they didn't realize the extent of the torment Layla was being subjected to. Caitlin sneered at Layla. "I'm warning you to stay away from Matthew," she said. Then she leaned in so close to Layla that their noses touched. "This is your first and last warning. If I find out you've tried to contact him, I won't be so kind next time." As far as Caitlin was concerned, Matthew belonged to her. Nobody else was allowed to like him, and she was sure that deep down, Matthew liked her too. So, if anybody else tried to pursue him, she would crush their intentions right from the start. Layla was becoming increasingly aware of the situation she had gotten herself into, and the trouble she had caused by offending Caitlin. Although she still thought that Caitlin was overbearing and couldn't stop her from having feelings for Matthew. But Layla wasn't about to refute what Caitlin had said. She was worried that if she provoked Caitlin further, she might not make it out of there alive. "I'm sorry," she said. "I really didn't know you were in love with Matthew. If I had, I never would have entertained my desire for him. I hope you can let me go, and we can forget this ever happened." She looked at Caitlin hopefully, but she was still trembling. Caitlin's lip curled as she looked at Layla with contempt. "I hope I don't need to remind you of the power my family has in this city," she warned. "It will be wise for you to do as I've said. Otherwise, I can't guarantee my actions will be so friendly next time." Caitlin pushed Layla's chin up higher, and Layla wondered how far her neck could stretch. Then Caitlin suddenly let go, and Layla's head jerked back, hitting the wall behind her. "Now get out of here," Caitlin said. "I don't want to have to see your face again." Layla touched a hand to the back of her head, and then she scuttled out of the clubhouse without giving Caitlin a second glance. The onlookers watched her leave and began muttering among themselves. Was that Layla Moore? How interesting. She must have a death wish, taking a fancy to Caitlin's boyfriend. After leaving Portland University, Matthew returned home, and he was surprised to see a middle-aged man standing on his doorstep. When the man saw Matthew, his expression held a trace of respect. "Hello, Mr. Ford," the man said. "I've come to give you this." He held out a crisp white envelope. "It's an invitation from the Rodney family. They're holding a gathering this evening, and they hope you will be able to attend." "The Rodney family?" Matthew asked doubtfully. "Are you sure?" Matthew had never heard of the Rodney family holding such an event before, but they actually held one every year. It was an opportunity for all the small families that depended on them to survive to gather together for one special evening. The reason Matthew had never been invited before was that everyone had considered him to be the useless son-in-law of the Cavill family. And as even the rest of the Cavill family members weren't important enough to attend the event, then no one would have dreamed of inviting Matthew. But Matthew's prominence had risen lately, and the Rodneys had felt he should get an invitation. The man looked at Matthew sheepishly and said, "I sincerely hope you will accept the invitation, Mr. Ford. I don't want to be scolded by Mr. Rodney upon my return." Matthew felt a pang of pity for the man, and decided he couldn't reject the request. He nodded his agreement, and the man thanked him and left. Matthew thought about how, on the surface, the Rodney family seemed to control most of Portland, but the Gateway Group, along with a few other people, had helped more families rise to fame in the city. He believed the Hamilton family was likely the most famous. Only a year ago, they had still been a small family. But after having made a connection with Phil Dawes, they were able to compete with the Rodney family. Therefore, the Rodney family was most likely trying to strengthen their network with such gatherings. After all, they wouldn't want too many of the small families seeking support elsewhere. Many of the people attending the event that evening were top figures in Portland, and they attended the gatherings out of respect for the Rodney family. They were concerned that if they didn't show up, they might get blacklisted. The small families were always at the mercy of the Rodney family, and it made them feel helpless. They envied those who seemed to have endless wealth when theirs could be snatched away at any moment. Matthew went inside, showered, and changed into a smart suit. He grabbed the keys to the car from the table and opened the garage. However, the car was missing, so he assumed Mia must have taken it. Matthew wondered what to do, but with no time to hire a car, he decided he would have to take the bus. When the bus arrived and the door swung open, the driver said, "Wow, look at you all dressed up in a suit. Where are you going?" "The Palm Pavilion," Matthew replied. He showed the driver his bus pass and went to find a seat. Just as Matthew was getting settled, a young man came and sat down next to him. Glancing at him, the man asked, "Did I just hear you say you're going to the Palm Pavilion?" The young man looked at Matthew expectantly. "You did say the Palm Pavilion, didn't you?" the man asked again. "Please, don't tell me you're hoping to find a woman there. They're all a bunch of rich kids who look down their noses at you. They won't even let you buy them a drink." The young man spoke as if he had experienced such a thing firsthand, and believed Matthew could sympathize with him. The man remembered a good friend of his going to the Palm Pavilion when they had been at university. He had accidentally offended one of the women, and before he had a chance to apologize, he had received a beating from one of her friends and had ended up in the hospital. Since he had heard that story, the name Palm Pavilion had always stirred up negative connotations. Matthew shook his head. "I have an invitation from the Rodney family to attend one of their gatherings." The young man looked surprised and turned his face away. He was momentarily speechless, unsure how to respond. When he turned back to look at Matthew, he asked, "Did you just get on the bus to find someone to brag to about the gathering?" He shook his head. "Nobody attends an upper-class event by bus. They all have fancy cars." The man turned away again, too many thoughts running through his mind. He felt he needed a minute to get them all in order. "When you get there," he said, spinning his whole body around to face Matthew, "you'll see a variety of cars, but not one of them will be worth less than $100,000. And you're going to turn up on a bus? You have got to be kidding me." He leaned back in his seat, and silence fell for a moment. "You know, we're all just ordinary people," he said, looking at Matthew with a hint of pity. "You don't have to pretend to be someone you're not." Matthew looked at the man. "I really do have an invite," he insisted. The man tutted angrily. "Whatever," he said, getting up from his seat. "Clearly, we have nothing in common." With that, he stumbled down the gangway and found another seat. A little while later, the bus pulled up at a stop not far from the Palm Pavilion, and Matthew walked the short distance to the venue. By the time he arrived, he could see that the parking lot was full to the brim with the type of extravagant cars the man on the bus had predicted. The two women standing at the door to greet the guests noticed Matthew's arrival. "Did he just get off the bus?" one woman whispered to the other. "Who gets the bus to a high-class event like this?" "Maybe he's trying to keep a low profile," the other woman replied. In an instant, she was picturing her future with the man. She would charm him as she welcomed him inside, and then he would offer to take her for a meal. Then, after that, he would lavish her with gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and her life from then on would be carefree. She nodded her head, certain that she was correct. Rich people might drive luxury cars, but it was the real big shots that had to keep a low profile. As the man grew nearer, the woman stepped forward to greet him. The woman led Matthew into the restaurant. "Mr. Ford, please let me know if there's anything you need," one woman said, smiling at him. "Thank you," Matthew said, nodding. Then both women turned and walked away. As they left, the first woman asked, "Who do you think that man is? I've never seen him before. And why are you acting so respectful to him?" "I don't know," the second woman said, shrugging. "But he could be a very rich man." The first woman scoffed. "I doubt that very much. We both saw him arrive by bus." "Yes," the second woman replied. "But he had an invitation, so he must belong here." "He's probably just messing around," the first woman said, waving a dismissive hand. "He's probably just pretending to be a rich man so he can find a girlfriend." The second woman shrugged, not sure what to think. Matthew was busy scanning the many faces in the hall when somebody else entered the room. Matthew immediately recognized him as the studious young man from the university. The newcomer also cast an eye around the room, and when he saw Matthew standing to one side, he headed in his direction. He didn't seem to care that people were blocking his path, but the crowds parted to let him through. The two women who greeted the guests noticed the man and alerted the security guards, who immediately surrounded him. The man seemed unperturbed by it all as he smiled at Matthew. "I believe I owe you a thank you," he said. Matthew was taken aback, and he admired the man. As he had expected, the man appeared to be very shrewd, and not someone ordinary people could control. "Why do you need to thank me?" Matthew asked, a little bemused. After all, he had known the man didn't need his assistance. The man stared directly at Matthew, barely registering the guards around him. Then he shook his head. "Of course I have to thank you," he said, smiling again. "If you hadn't stopped that idiot earlier, then who knows what I would have done. And it would have likely ended with me getting expelled from the university." The man spoke calmly and precisely, and Matthew was completely intrigued by him. The security guards looked at the man with derision, and one of them stepped forward to speak to Matthew. "Mr. Ford," the guard said, "I do apologize. We should have been more alert to this man approaching you. We'll remove him now." The security guards had been warned of Matthew's status by the Rodney family, so they didn't dare allow anyone to offend him. The security guards wanted to throw the young man out, but Matthew waved his hand slightly to stop them. "It's all right," he said. "This is a friend of mine. But maybe I was a little late to step in and caused some trouble for everyone. I apologize for that." When the security guards realized the man was Matthew's friend, They all looked a little embarrassed. They quickly turned to the young man. "We're very sorry," one of them said politely. "We didn't know you were a good friend of Mr. Ford, so I hope you'll forgive us." Matthew gestured at the security guards as if to suggest everything was settled, and then he asked them to leave. Although he didn't know exactly why the strange young man had sought him out, he thought he could guess. Besides, he knew if he didn't investigate what the man wanted, he might end up being a hidden threat. If that were the case, then Matthew would rather keep the young man close so he could watch him carefully. If the man really had any intention of harming him, then Matthew would be in a position to respond quickly. "Do you want me to join you at the party?" the young man asked. Matthew shrugged. "Of course," he replied. "But tell me your name first." "I'm Jude Osborne," the young man replied. Matthew decided not to worry about why Jude was there. For the time being, they would simply attend the party. When they entered the room, Matthew decided to sit in a dark corner and observe the guests as they mingled and chatted. Matthew's status had reached such a high level that he didn't think any of the guests had a right to speak to him, and he wasn't interested in talking to such so-called powerful people. From what he could see, the guests all had some status in Portland. Most of them could be divided into two factions. One faction belonged to the Rodney family, and the other group belonged to a new family called the Hamiltons. The power in the city seemed to have been redistributed between two major powers, and all the supporters had been mixed up and reorganized. As Matthew faced the people from two important families, he had his own decision to make. Although he was an immortal venerable, and they were no match for him when he was in the celestial realm, Matthew could understand why they needed to hold such gatherings. Every person had a force behind them, and each small confrontation involved hidden loyalties to different factions. No one wanted to be indecisive or neutral, because they knew if they wanted to survive, they had to rely on one of the two most famous families in Portland. But they didn't know which of those families could give them the greatest power. They knew if they chose the wrong side, it could be disastrous for everyone. Just like in the celestial realm, entire families could be destroyed until there wasn't a single person left. So sometimes, even if someone wanted to remain neutral, they ultimately had to pick a side in order to survive. Matthew sat with Jude in a corner, slowly sipping the wine in his glass as he watched the partygoers in front of him. He could tell most of the people there were rich, but there were also a lot of beautiful women as well. And Matthew knew some of them didn't really have the right to be there. But every time such a party took place, those women would find a way to use their looks to get in, and all the major families would turn a blind eye to it and not pay them much attention. The women had a very simple goal. They just wanted to find a rich man and charm him. If they could do that, then they would gain more money and advantages than they could possibly imagine. The women knew everyone was there for their own reasons, and they didn't think there was anything brazen or immoral about what they did. Among the crowd, Matthew suddenly noticed the beautiful woman who had taken the bottle of water from his car. The woman in question was Charlotte Wood. She was currently wearing a gorgeous evening gown that made the most of her figure, and she had a seductive look on her face that attracted glances from most of the men at the party. Despite what Matthew believed, Charlotte hadn't taken the bottle of water that he had placed on the car as some kind of signal. For her, it was a way of getting to know people who were higher up the social hierarchy than she was. If Matthew or the man in the other car had taken her out, then she knew she could have relied on her charms to stay with them. Then she would have been constantly spoiled with generous and extravagant gestures that would have demonstrated their status. She was very confident about that. Although her dress appeared to be relatively cheap, she still looked very attractive and radiated a charming aura. She caught the attention of a lot of men, which was exactly what she wanted. Charlotte looked around arrogantly and sized up the people she could see. Some of them were part of a major family, but others weren't. Two men in particular caught her eye, Matthew and Jude. Charlotte frowned when she saw them. Even with her good looks, it hadn't been easy for her to sneak into the party, and she knew those two men had no money or status, but they had still been able to attend such a high-profile event. A fierce look appeared on Charlotte's face, and she slowly walked toward Matthew and Jude. As she stepped in front of Matthew, she stumbled a little, and her glass of wine flew out of her hand. The wine was headed toward Matthew's inexpensive suit, but a look of contempt appeared on his face, and he moved away slightly. The wine spilled onto the table instead. "I didn't expect you to be so agile," Charlotte said, raising an eyebrow. "Do you know which family is hosting this party? I can't believe you dared sneak in. You really have some guts. But you should hurry up and get out of here. If the security guards find out you're here, it won't end well for you." A contemptuous smile appeared on Matthew's face. "You don't have the right to kick us out of here, do you?" he asked in a low voice. "Besides, I guess you have some kind of shameful reason for being here too. And if that's the case, why do we have to attack each other?" "Of course I have a reason," Charlotte replied with disdain. "But I'm not sure my reason is the same as yours. You sneaked in here, and I walked in openly. I don't think we're on the same side." Jude smiled indifferently as he glanced around at the men at the party. "Are you after them?" he asked. "Are you sure you want to cause trouble for them?" Most of the people there had a high status and were extremely rich and powerful. But the average age of the men was around 50 years old. They were old enough to be Charlotte's father. Charlotte's expression suddenly became very serious. "You don't need to worry about me," she said to Jude. "It has nothing to do with you. But you two losers actually managed to sneak in. So I guess you guys are going to get into trouble. I wonder what I can do to make sure that happens. She deliberately pulled at her dress to make herself look a little disheveled. There are people here being rowdy and aggressive, she shouted. Where is the security guard? These men weren't invited to this party, and they tried to touch me. Get them out of here now. The security team at the venue was usually quite thorough, but it also prioritized people according to their power and status. If two men had entered the party without an invitation and made a move on one of the women there, it showed the security team hadn't been as careful as it should have been. When they heard Charlotte shout, several security guards rushed into the room and approached her, looking a little embarrassed. Please, keep your voice down in here, one of them said to Charlotte. The security guards knew her shouting had already made some guests unhappy, but they also knew if they wanted to calm them down, they would have to make sure Charlotte kept her cool first. Charlotte was a little scared. She had taken a risk making a scene in the middle of the party, and when she thought about it, she quieted down. She smiled at the head security guard, whose identity badge proclaimed his name was Ted. I'm sorry, she said. These men tried to touch me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have shouted. It was all their fault. Ted didn't care what Charlotte said. He appreciated her good looks, but working as security guards allowed him and his colleagues to meet a lot of beautiful women, so they wouldn't give Charlotte any special treatment. The security guards thought if there was a chance they could get into trouble because of Charlotte, they may as well throw her out of the party and avoid any unpleasantness. But since she had become quiet and was listening to them, Ted decided she wasn't too much of a risk. Ted turned to stare at Matthew. Do you have an invitation, sir? He asked. Matthew slowly took a sip from his wine glass and then said, No. All the security guards' expressions became extremely somber. They wondered how the two men had gotten in without an invitation and whether there was something wrong with their security procedures. But regardless of that, they had no doubt that the two men weren't guests at the party and had somehow snuck in. Ted began to look very uncomfortable. The fact that people had walked in without an invitation right under the security guards' noses was enough to prove their security processes weren't comprehensive enough. There were a lot of important people at the party, and if anything happened to them, the security guards knew they would be in serious trouble. I told you they didn't have an invitation, Charlotte said, her expression smug. Hurry up and get rid of them. Who knows why they're here? You can't afford to offend any of the important people at this party. Ted frowned. If the woman hadn't said anything, then no one else would have known about the situation. It was only because she had started shouting that people had paid any attention. But the security guards knew if William Rodney found out about the matter, then they would lose their jobs. Ted looked at Matthew and Jude. Please, get out of here, he said calmly. You're not allowed to come in without an invitation. A contemptuous smile appeared on Matthew's face. William Rodney personally invited me here," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure you want to kick me out?" All the other partygoers looked extremely shocked. Everyone in Portland knew the Rodney family held all the power there, and there were only 2 people William would personally invite to such an event. The first was Phil Dawes, and the second was Estelle Bryant. Matthew was obviously neither of those people, so no one could understand why he was special enough for William to invite him to such a grand party. Charlotte couldn't believe what she had heard. "What did you just say?" she asked. "Did you say the Rodney family invited you here? Who are you? Why would William invite you here?" But her mocking tone made all the other guests stare at her with disgust. If someone really had managed to sneak in, it could only have been because the security guards hadn't been doing their job properly, and they would be humiliated for that. But everyone thought Charlotte was being unreasonable. Even if Matthew deserved to be ridiculed, Charlotte wasn't the person to do it. They all knew she had her own reasons for being there, so she had no right to drag others down. Ted knew there were a lot of important people around him, and they all looked very unhappy. But he wasn't sure what was the best thing to do, so he fell silent for a moment. But then he turned to Charlotte and gave her a ferocious look. "Who gave you the right to decide who gets in here?" he asked aggressively. "Shut up!" Charlotte frowned. She had plans to marry a rich man from an important family, so she didn't think a lowly security guard should dare talk to her like that. But she also knew she wasn't actually anyone important in Portland, so although she felt indignant, there was nothing she could do about it. But then she realized that if William found out about what had happened that day, all the security guards would probably be fired. She knew they enjoyed the power they had at important occasions, like the party. So it would be a good result for her if they did lose their jobs. Ted frowned when he realized what Charlotte was thinking. "If you don't have an invitation, then please get out of here," he said to Matthew and Jude. Matthew smiled slightly and slowly swirled the wine around in his glass. "The most powerful man in the city invited me here," he said. "If you don't believe me, you can ask William himself. Are you sure you're brave enough to throw me out of here?" Ted's expression grew uneasy. He knew very well that the Rodney family held an event every year, but he had never heard of anyone coming in without an invitation. He knew if he didn't do anything, then William would punish him when he arrived, and if that happened, he would be more worried about losing his life than just losing his job. "It makes no difference if I'm brave enough or not," Ted said. "If you don't have an invitation, then you have to get out. That's the rule. If you still won't leave, I'll have to take matters into my own hands." Charlotte was thrilled. She knew she was about to get her revenge, and Matthew would find himself in a very miserable situation. On the second floor, William was watching everything happening below. "What happened?" he asked a female staff member. "Is that woman a friend of Luke Hamilton?" The woman in uniform took a closer look at the person William was pointing at, and then she suddenly looked very scared. When she looked down at the scene below, she had immediately spotted Matthew, and she knew things were going to get ugly. She couldn't believe Matthew was actually there. He was one of the most powerful people in Portland, and she was stunned that someone would dare treat him with so little respect. Her face became extremely pale, and she turned to William. "Mr. Rodney," she said, "I'll go and settle this matter now." William suddenly decided he didn't care about the situation at that moment. He shook his head slightly and smiled. "Settle what matters?" he asked, shrugging. "Nothing happened, so don't worry about it for now."
"But that's Mr. Ford," the woman replied. "If we just stand back and watch, someone might upset him. Then what do we do?" Her expression was very serious, and it was obvious she was scared. William flashed her a relaxed smile. "There's nothing going on that can't be solved," he said calmly. "I think that woman is linked to the Hamilton family." Several other members of the Rodney family were gathered around, and they all looked happy when they heard that. But they still didn't know why the Hamilton family had been able to increase its power to such an extent, or why it was able to stand against the Rodney family. But without a doubt, Portland wasn't the Rodney family's territory. It was Matthew's. And the minor family that was slowly rising in prominence didn't know how powerful Matthew really was. William thought the Hamilton family was taking an enormous risk, so he didn't want to miss an opportunity to let them destroy themselves. Downstairs at the party, a male voice suddenly rang out. "I didn't expect to see you two here. You're just two ordinary people, and you have no right to attend this event." As everyone looked in the direction the voice had come from, they saw Luke approaching Matthew and the security guards. He was dressed in extremely smart and expensive clothes, and he clearly belonged there. A haughty smile appeared on his face, and he looked at the people in front of him with disdain. Not everyone had authority at the party, but Luke knew he did. After all, he considered himself the second most important person in Portland, so the people he usually came into contact with were the top figures in the city. If Luke said the young men didn't have the right to be at the party, then everyone knew they shouldn't be there. Ted felt slightly relieved. When they had been talking, one of the young men had been very arrogant, so he had been a little worried. He was afraid that the young man might actually be someone important, and if he provoked him, he would find himself in no end of trouble. But Luke had arrived and had spoken so authoritatively that Ted decided he didn't need to be afraid of the young man. "Did you hear that?" he said to Matthew and Jude. "Even if you won't listen to me, you should know who that man is. That's Luke Hamilton, and he's one of the most important young men in Portland. Now, Do you two want to walk out of here voluntarily or be thrown out?" But Matthew didn't pay any attention to Ted. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Luke. "I advise you not to cause trouble for the Hamilton family," he said. "Cause trouble for the Hamilton family?" Luke repeated. "My family isn't afraid of trouble. What right does someone as unimportant as you have to be here? Do you know how powerful and influential everyone else is?" As the crowd listened to Luke mock Matthew, they all felt a little smug as they remembered their own statuses. After all, not everyone could attend the Rodney family's party. Everyone smiled to themselves. They were enjoying seeing someone make a fool of themselves. Although they didn't have any particular allegiance to Luke, his words had given them a good impression of the Hamilton family, and they all started to speak in support of him. "What Luke said is true. All of us here are top business people." "You're just a nobody. What right do you have to be here with us?" "That's right. A minor figure should be aware of their own limitations. Hurry up and get out of here." "If you don't leave, you'll be forced out, and the consequences won't be good." "If someone here makes Luke unhappy, I'll help drive him out." Everyone sneered. They were happy to have someone there that they could mock. When he heard the crowd support, Luke's gaze became even more contemptuous. He didn't think someone as unimportant as Matthew had any right to be at the same party as him. He smiled at Matthew as he slowly walked toward him. "Did you hear that?" Luke asked. "Get out of here right now. You've already offended the guests here. So do you really think you can fight all the major families in Portland by yourself? If you don't leave now, the Hamilton family will make sure you suffer the consequences of your actions." Before Matthew could say anything, Jude looked at Luke like he was a fool and shook his head. "Trust me," he said. "If you do this, you'll only bring a huge amount of trouble to the Hamiltons." Jude knew very well that someone who had been personally invited to an event by the head of the Rodney family wasn't someone to be messed with. An ordinary person had no chance against them. But Luke just looked at Jude with contempt. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. And then he turned back to Matthew. "You've brought all this on yourself." Luke smiled faintly at Matthew, and then he suddenly threw a punch at him. But Matthew stretched out his right hand and firmly grabbed Luke's fist. Luke gaped at him in shock. As a member of the Hamilton family, he had practiced martial arts since he had been young. He thought he would be able to overpower 2 or 3 strong men at the same time. But Matthew was alone, and he had actually been able to grasp Luke's fist, holding him in place. Luke suddenly realized Matthew was much stronger than he had realized. But despite that, he didn't think Matthew could do anything to him. Luke had the support of the Hamilton family, so no matter what he did, he knew his family would take responsibility for him. Even if he knocked Matthew to the floor in front of everyone, no one would dare say anything about it and he wouldn't need to deal with the consequences of his actions. That was the advantage of belonging to a powerful family, and it was something most people couldn't even imagine. "Remember, you forced me to do this," Luke said to Matthew, "and you're taking a big risk." As soon as he had finished speaking, Luke took a shiny dagger from his pocket. The cold light reflected off the blade as he swung it toward Matthew. When everyone saw what was happening, no one tried to stop him. They just watched with interest. They thought the young man had been foolish to provoke Luke and the Hamilton family. He was putting his life on the line, and if he had left earlier or apologized to Luke, then the Hamiltons would probably have forgiven him. But he had already made his move, so it wouldn't be so easy to solve the problem anymore. As Matthew noticed the gleaming dagger, a contemptuous smile spread over his face. The next moment, he punched Luke hard, sending him flying. Luke knocked down a few nearby tables as he fell, and then he slowly came to a stop. He lay on the floor, staring at Matthew with resentment and a sense of injustice. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. "How dare you hit me?" Ever since the Hamilton family had started to compete with William and the Rodneys, there weren't many people in Portland who would dare attack Luke. Luke slowly wiped a trickle of blood from his split lip, and he felt rage rise up in him. Trembling, he slowly got to his feet, and then he glared at Matthew fiercely. "You'll pay for what you've done," he said. "I'll hurt you, and no one can stop me." Charlotte was ecstatic. Matthew had offended her, and although she hadn't thought she could do anything to him by herself, she had still hoped to get him into trouble. She thought if Matthew offended Luke, then he wouldn't be able to continue living in Portland. "Luke, are you all right?" Charlotte asked. "It was all this guy's fault, so you mustn't let him leave. If you don't destroy him today, you won't be able to show your face in Portland in the future." On the surface, she appeared to be very concerned about Luke, but in reality, she was stirring up the anger he already felt. She knew the important families valued their reputations above everything, and someone had actually dared attack Luke, so he wouldn't be able to just walk away. If he let Matthew go easily now, then other insignificant people might also think they could do the same thing. Luke grew even more furious, and he wished he could destroy Matthew there and then. He picked up a piece of a broken wine bottle that had smashed when he had knocked over the tables, and then he held it to Matthew's throat. William was still on the second floor, but he smiled faintly, thinking it was almost time. He knew if he didn't make a move, Matthew might not be very happy. As he thought of that, he heard a piercing sound rush through the air. When he looked down, he saw a silver knife embedded in the wooden floor. "What's going on?" William asked loudly. "Who told you to do this? This is the Rodney family's party. Did I ask anyone to do something for me?" Everyone in the room was shocked. They followed the sound and looked up, spotting William slowly walking down the stairs to join the party. Everyone was speechless, and the atmosphere became extremely tense. "It's the head of the Rodney family," someone said. "How did he sneak into his own party so quietly?" someone else asked. "Don't worry, Mr. Rodney," Ted said. "I'll throw this man out now." He gave William a very respectful look, but he was clearly afraid. He tried his best to hide it, but he hadn't expected William to intervene directly in the situation. If he didn't do something straight away, he was worried that William would get angry with him, and then he might lose his job. William looked around at everyone with contempt. "What exactly is going on?" he asked. "Why are you making such a fuss? This is my party, so I don't want anyone to make things difficult for me." Ted looked extremely uncomfortable. He quickly lowered his head and decided to admit his mistake. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rodney," he said meekly. "I wasn't watching the door properly, and I let these people get in. But I'll throw them out now, and I hope the Rodney family can give me another chance." William gave him an ominous look. "Who told you that I want to kick this man out?" he asked, pointing at Matthew. Everyone there decided to suddenly speak up. They thought that would attract William's attention, and he would be more likely to do their businesses a favor. "This man is totally incompatible with the Rodney family social circle." "Yeah, he's not one of us." "Hurry up and throw him out. Don't let him cause trouble here." "I can just about tolerate him, but no one else wants to." Everyone was happy to mock Matthew, and they thought they were doing the right thing. But William's next sentence shocked them. "This young man doesn't need an invitation to my party," William said, his tone chilly. "I invited him personally." All the guests were stunned, and they started to tremble with fear. They considered themselves well-known figures in Portland, and the invitations they had received had been personally issued by the Rodney family. But they were shocked that the young man had been invited by William himself. They wondered what kind of person he was, what kind of status he had, and why a giant like the Rodney family had been keen to reach out to him on such an important occasion. They all started to whisper to each other about the situation. "He was invited here personally by William. How is this possible? William has never personally invited anyone else." Everyone assumed Matthew was a powerful man, and they were extremely shocked. But Ted was even more terrified. He didn't understand how guests who had been invited by William could seem like inexperienced nobodies who had just snuck into the party. He couldn't see how it was possible. "I'm sorry," Ted said. "It's all my fault, but I hope you won't treat me too harshly." He was so scared that his face had turned extremely pale, and his legs were trembling so badly he could barely stand. The beads of cold sweat on his forehead started to run down his face. Charlotte was even more shocked. She had never thought a man who rented a car could have such an impressive status. She had assumed he was just an ordinary person because he wore scruffy clothes, and she couldn't understand why someone like that was being treated so well by the Rodney family. Luke's eyes narrowed.
The confrontation had been extremely public, and yet William was obviously siding with his opponent. He thought about the Rodneys and realized that if they wanted to target Luke and the Hamilton family, they had the perfect opportunity. At that realization, his expression grew despondent. He briefly considered whether the man William had invited was powerful and influential, but then he decided that the man was probably nothing more than a way for the Rodney family to crush the Hamiltons. He slowly walked forward, looking at William with a frosty expression. "Is inviting a young man like this actually worth your while?" he asked. "I don't care if it's a tactic, or if he really is your guest, but he's making things difficult for me, which means he's making things difficult for the Hamilton family. Do you want to give me an explanation for this?" William stared at Luke with contempt. "You want an explanation from me?" he asked. "The Hamilton family has just risen to power, and the Rodney family has never had to look up to anyone before. But this man is the Rodney family's special guest. So how dare you offend him? And I can't believe you have the nerve to ask me to give you an explanation." Luke's expression darkened. Initially, he had thought William was just using the opportunity to keep him in check, and he thought it was impossible for William to actually make things difficult for him. After all, Luke and William were equal in strength, so even William couldn't ignore Luke's status. But things didn't seem to have developed as Luke had imagined, so he couldn't help but feel puzzled. He wondered if the young man really was someone very important. But if that was the case, Luke didn't understand why he had acted so cowardly when he had first met him. With that thought in mind, Luke turned back to William. "You should be careful," he said in a low voice. "I'm sure we'll encounter each other a lot in the future, so I suggest you don't go too far now." Luke believed William would show him respect. He was a leader of the Hamilton family, and if he were to fight William, a major war would break out between the Rodneys and the Hamiltons. Neither family would benefit from that. William glanced at Luke with a contemptuous expression. He didn't pay any attention to him or what he was saying. He signaled to a few of the security guards to do the job they were being paid for, and they quickly tackled Luke to the ground, making it difficult for him to get up. Although Luke had some strength, the Rodney family's security guards were all acquired staged warriors, so they wouldn't lose to someone who was less experienced in martial arts. "You'll regret this," Luke shouted. "I promise you'll regret this. Aren't you afraid the Hamilton family will crush you for this?" William took out his phone and dialed the number for Luke's father, Patrick Hamilton. "We're having a family gathering today," he said, not bothering to introduce himself or offer any pleasantries. "I'll get right to the point. It's come to my attention that your son, Luke, has attacked one of my guests. I suggest you come here as soon as possible to sort this out." They were both from prominent and influential families, but William knew Patrick couldn't ignore the request. Patrick probably felt that his son was perfectly safe because he was protected by his family name, and the fact that no one wanted to deal with the ramifications of the Hamiltons and Rodneys being at war. "Are you sure you understand the situation correctly?" Patrick asked. "I'm sure it must have been your guest who provoked my son. Otherwise, why would he have reacted? How about I leave this with you? You can have a word with your guest, and then we'll forget this ever happened. This isn't a matter which can be resolved so easily," William said, his tone flat and hard. "That's why I've already asked you to come. I strongly recommend you get here right away." Patrick frowned. There weren't many people in Portland who hadn't already learned not to mess with his son. He would always back Luke up, no matter how much trouble he caused. So he wondered if William was trying to pick a fight with their family and build tension between them. "If I go, I might look weak," he thought. "But something about this feels off. And there's no reason to worry about walking into a situation where I know the other people involved." "Fine," he said, his tone a little frosty. "I'll be there shortly, but I don't appreciate you making this more difficult than it needs to be." William found himself grinning. Patrick was going to arrive with just the attitude he expected, and he wasn't going to be dealing with the person he thought. The Hamiltons were influential, almost on par with his own family, and normally he would never have touched Luke. But he knew he had something to gain from the current situation. Luke had tangled with someone seriously powerful, and William intended to be on Matthew's side. Patrick was still waiting for a response. "I've said everything I need to for now," William said. But then he decided to have a little fun. After all, it couldn't hurt. Whatever happened, Patrick would still have to come and deal with his son. "I just wanted acknowledged that you can't blame me for not warning you," William said. "If you can't smooth things over with Mr. Ford, then who knows what will happen?" "Mr. Ford," Patrick repeated with a growl. "I don't care about your Mr. Ford or Mr. Smith or Mr. Johnson, for that matter. I can see your scheming and tricks a mile away." He paused for a moment, and then he said, "Wait, did you say his surname is Ford?" "I did," William confirmed. "I'll be right there," Patrick said, and then he ended the call as realization dawned. Did he mean Matthew Ford? The Hamilton family may not have been established for as long as others in Portland, but everyone had heard the name Matthew Ford, and the stories about him just kept spreading. Patrick knew that even if the Hamiltons and the Rodneys joined forces, they still wouldn't be able to match the power and influence that Matthew had. In fact, he would crush them easily. He seemed to just click his fingers, and the world trembled and rushed to do what he asked. If Luke had gotten involved with Mr. Ford, it could spell a huge amount of trouble. How could Luke be so stupid? Patrick asked no one in particular as he headed for the door. Even Phil Dawes and Estelle Bryant, two of the most powerful people in Portland, spoke respectfully of Matthew. And yet Patrick's idiotic son had decided to pick a fight with him. Luke was putting on a brave face,
but he was trembling. It had been a long time since anyone dared to order him around, let alone tackled him to the floor. Plus, that fall had hurt, and the guards were refusing to let him go. He struggled to get out of the guard's hold and get to William.
"You'd better let me go," he shouted. "You have no idea what's coming for you when my father arrives. Are you trying to start a war?"
William didn't move or respond, but the corner of his mouth was twitching. He waited for Luke to finish, and then he shook his head slightly. "Your father will be here soon," he said. "Until then, you're staying put. You should use the time to figure out how to explain this to him." Luke looked at him with disdain, thinking William obviously didn't understand the situation. As far as he was concerned, it was William who would have to explain things to Patrick, not him. Charlotte was listening from a short distance away, and a slow smile spread over her face. Matthew wasn't being kicked out yet, but things were turning out even better than she had expected. Everyone would have to pick sides if there was a fight between the two families. There was no certain winner, so she would have to watch closely and pick sides at the best moment. Whoever was humiliated and lost their position would leave an opening that she could step into. The only concern was whether the person Luke had offended was a big enough deal to create the amount of tension needed for a fight. It seemed like he was, since William had personally invited him. But perhaps that was all a ploy. "I'll stay close and see what happens," she thought. "Lots of others can benefit from this too. Especially the merchants who weren't directly tied to a family. So I can make alliances there." At that moment, William turned back toward Matthew and nodded to him respectfully. "My apologies, Mr. Ford, for being delayed," he said, clearing his throat. "I was just dealing with a minor inconvenience." Matthew stared at him, his expression unamused. "I have also been dealing with a minor inconvenience," he answered, his tone like ice. "A member of the Hamilton family attacked me at your party. I hope you have everything in order now. You're a smart man, and I don't think I have to spell out the consequences of wasting my time, or trying to use this to your advantage. I'll also expect a full explanation, after this situation is resolved, of why this happened in the first place. Otherwise, your family name will cease to exist in Portland." Matthew's eyes bored into William. He didn't trust him one bit, especially since he had only appeared on the scene after Matthew had started fighting with someone from the Hamilton family. Whatever his plan was, Matthew would find out, because it wasn't the first time someone had tried to use him to dispose of their opposition. If William was planning that, he would pay a heavy price. Other Rodney family members had heard the exchange. They took their cue from William, though, so they didn't respond. They simply stood a polite distance away and carried on with their conversations. But seeing William being so polite increased their unease, and they were all very careful not to look in Matthew's direction. Less than 5 minutes later, Patrick arrived and was directed to the hall. The first person he spotted was Matthew, and he went white as a sheet.
He had heard rumors of what Matthew looked like, and he could also feel the power surrounding him. Luke saw his father approaching, and when the security guards released their hold, he started forward, but the guards moved to block his path. "Dad," he shouted, "they're keeping me here against my will. It's insulting. And that man over there hit me. You have to do something. He should have to leave Portland for good." Patrick blanched and walked toward his son. Only a few people in the entire city would get away with speaking about Matthew like that, and Luke was not one of them. Also, making Matthew disappear from Portland sounded like a pathetic joke. No one had that sort of power. "Shut up," Patrick ordered, glaring at his son. "You have no idea what you're doing, and you're way over the line." Luke flinched back from the force of his father's anger, blinking slowly in confusion. As far as he was aware, he wasn't the one in the wrong, so his father's reaction didn't make any sense. Then again, nothing made sense lately. People who would normally leave him alone for fear of his father's wrath were acting shocked and disapproving. He looked slowly around for the first time, taking in the mixture of expressions on everyone's faces. His father always sided with him, no matter what he did, even within their own family. Luke was the eldest son, the golden boy. But apparently, that was no longer true. "It's not because this involves the Rodneys," Luke thought in confusion. "I've upset them before. There must be another explanation. I wish someone would tell me what's going on." He glanced imploringly back at his father, but Patrick was walking away from him toward the man who had hit him. Some people were edging away from that area of the room, while others still looked on with confused expressions. Several people began to whisper to each other, "This is going to end badly." "I don't see what the big fuss is about. This is just some ordinary guy, right? I know he was personally invited by William, but the Hamiltons and Rodneys are still the most powerful families here." "Normally they just throw around threats and then go their separate ways." "Yeah, that guy's in for it. Even if he apologizes to Luke now, he's going to have to leave Portland for a while. I don't know. Something feels different here." Patrick reached Matthew and bowed his head, clasping his hands behind his back. "Mr. Ford," he began, "I'm Patrick Hamilton, and I apologize for my son's behavior." There was a collective gasp from the crowd. No one had expected an apology. "I promise that I will find a fitting punishment for him," Patrick continued, still staring at the floor. "I hope you can accept that and allow me to deal with this within the family. I will treat this matter with the utmost seriousness." There was an immediate uproar as the crowd exploded with conversation. There were so many stories about Mr. Ford that not everyone had heard all of them, and they spread through the crowd like wildfire. What's going on? Did he call him Mr. Ford? The Mr. Ford? No one who offends Mr. Ford ever has a good ending. This just isn't right. Patrick Hamilton never apologizes. Why is he doing this? Good old-fashioned fear, I think. According to the stories, Mr. Ford is so powerful that he has ties to all the oldest families in Portland. So, Why is he here at this party?
You know Estelle Bryant and Phil Dawes?
I heard even they are respectful around Mr. Ford.
Not everyone knew much about Matthew, but they all knew about Estelle and Phil. One of them controlled more than half the wealth in Portland, and the other controlled the criminal underworld. Neither of them was someone people wanted to get on the wrong side of. Matthew looked around at everyone, clearly unimpressed, and then he focused on Patrick. I saw your son making trouble the other day, and I dealt with it leniently because he's still young, he said. But today, he came and picked a fight with me. You want me to forget about it, just like that? Patrick glared over his shoulder at his son. He couldn't believe Luke had met Matthew before and hadn't told him about it. Luke's behavior was starting to look like a pattern, so Matthew might be less inclined to let Patrick deal with it. When I get him home, I will make sure he understands the error of his ways, Patrick promised. Please, extend me that grace just this once. I will make sure this never happens again. Luke was staring at his father, and he looked like he might be sick. His father wasn't the most influential person in Portland, but he was up there at the top, and yet he was dragging their name through the mud. He thought he should remind his father of who they were, because there must be a way for them to fight back. Dad, he called, as softly as he could with the conversation still happening around them. What are you doing? We're Hamiltons. There has to be a way to chase this guy out of the city. Patrick spun around, his face ashen, and then he stormed toward his son. He was trying his best to smooth over the whole situation, and Luke was making it worse at every turn. What was even more infuriating was that he kept repeating himself and solidifying what Matthew thought of him. Patrick pushed through the security guards until he was toe-to-toe with his son. You will apologize to Mr. Ford right now, Patrick shouted, jabbing his finger into Luke's chest. Apologize? Luke spluttered. You already did that, and I can't see why. Just because he's a guest of the Rodney family? They only invited him here to cause this whole situation. It's a setup. Don't you see? I won't apologize. If you won't protect our family name, then I'll have to. Patrick turned, almost purple with fury, and he grabbed Luke by the collar of his shirt. You heard me, he roared. I'm ordering you to apologize right now. He turned and started to drag Luke by his collar back toward Matthew. Everyone had been captivated by the scene unfolding in front of them, and it had been going so much further than anyone had thought possible. Patrick had quickly apologized, and then insisted that Luke apologize. There had to be so much more to Matthew than they had realized. Everyone was wondering what he would do if he was insulted, and how William had managed to get him to the party. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Estelle and Phil walked in, scanning the crowd. They were dressed immaculately and carried an air of confidence that no one could miss, so they immediately drew everyone's attention. They would never normally attend such a gathering, as they considered it beneath them, but they had gotten word that a situation was brewing involving Matthew, so they had come straight away. Matthew, however, was not pleased, and he crossed his arms and frowned at them.
He had wanted to keep everyone guessing about the true extent of his influence, and that was almost impossible if Estelle and Phil got involved. Patrick had frozen in the middle of the floor, still grasping Luke's shirt. His anger gave way to fear, and his mind raced with the implications of what was happening. No one would work with their company if there was even the slightest chance that they had upset Estelle and Phil. That sort of thing could bring ruin to a small family, or to families who were new to the scene. Their reputation was everything, and the Hamiltons were hanging by a thread. Matthew turned his attention to William, who was staring with shock at the two new guests. William had hoped to humiliate Patrick a little, and then use that to his advantage. But everything had spiraled way out of his control. It was turning into a huge scene with social implications for his own family. Whatever Estelle and Phil decided, their word was law. "Mr. Ford," Phil said, advancing through the crowd. "Mr. Ford," Estelle echoed, with a nod of her head toward Matthew. They both made their way over and stopped a respectful distance away. Then they waited, and the silence stretched as everyone in the room stared at them. The crowd watched on with shock and fear on their faces. It was extremely clear that Matthew's status was much higher than they had believed. Witnessing the way Phil and Estelle had greeted him had shed any doubt that they might have had about that. Luke viewed the scene with disbelief. His mouth fell open, and he was unable to hide his astonishment. He thought he had only offended an ordinary person, and yet two of the top figures in Portland had arrived and greeted Matthew with such respect. His face turned pale, and his body began to tremble. His legs felt weak, and he quickly found something to grab hold of, fearing he might fall and humiliate himself. After greeting Matthew, Phil turned and walked over to Patrick. "I see you've offended Matthew," Phil said. "Why don't you try offending me instead? Let's see what tricks you have up your sleeve. I'm sure they're nothing I can't handle." Nobody dared to make a sound. They knew they were nothing compared to Phil, so no matter what Phil said, they wouldn't dare refute it. Estelle cast a steely gaze over everyone, a look of contempt flashing across her features. She spoke clearly as she addressed the crowd. "I heard you were all looking down on Mr. Ford here," she said, sweeping a slender hand in Matthew's direction. "Unfortunately, I take that very personally. If you disrespect Mr. Ford, then you may as well be looking down on me. And if you are willing to do that, then I think you should pay me back the money I loaned you." Everyone was terrified of Phil's strength and high status, but it was Estelle's financial resources that they feared losing more. If Phil attacked them, then their company's reputations could be hurt. But it would not likely lead to their collapse. But without the financial backing from Estelle, they could be in big trouble. There were often times when money wasn't flowing quite as efficiently as they hoped, and they were always able to turn to Estelle for help. They relied on Estelle to keep their companies afloat when times were tough, and they wouldn't dream of offending her in case she withdrew that support. Everyone's faces grew ashen, and they began stumbling over their words as they tried to placate her. "Please understand," one man said. "We didn't have even the slightest intentions of looking down on Mr. Ford. We didn't do anything to offend him. It was them." A woman pointed a bony finger toward Patrick and Luke. Patrick and Luke were surprised that the surrounding families would throw them to the wolves so easily. They didn't see why they should suddenly feel so superior. But the crowd was secretly delighted they had someone to blame for the trouble they had found themselves in. To them, as long as they could save themselves, they didn't care if they brought misfortune to someone else. Estelle's icy gaze told everyone in the crowd that their attempts to shift blame would be futile, no matter how much they protested. There was nothing more they could do, and the die had already been cast. "You will no longer have any business dealings with me or my company," Estelle said authoritatively. Although they wanted to plead with Estelle to reconsider, her expression told them that it was her final word. One by one, they bowed their heads in defeat, knowing that they were truly finished. Then Estelle turned away from the crowd and directed her next comment at Patrick. "As of today," she said, her eyes dancing, "I think your company should cease to operate. I also think it would be in your best if you consider finding somewhere else to live. After today, I doubt you'll find much success in Portland." Patrick looked at Estelle, despair radiating from him. He considered himself to be a smart person, and he had raised his family to a level of importance that matched that of the Rodney family. But he had let his weakness ruin them. His weakness was the extent to which he doted on his son. He knew he had spoiled Luke too much, but he was his only son, and he was unable to have any more children. That was why, no matter what mistakes Luke made or which top families he offended, Patrick had always protected him from any backlash. But because of such tampering, Luke had never learned the cost of his mistakes, and he had developed an overbearing attitude. Luke looked down on everyone, considering himself above the whole of Portland. He believed himself to be untouchable, and that nobody would dare make a move against him. But it had only been a matter of time before an attitude like that backfired, and the repercussions could be fatal. Although it was Estelle who had spoken, Patrick addressed Matthew when he replied. "I know I was wrong, Mr. Ford," Patrick said, hanging his head in shame. "From now on, all the property belonging to the Hamilton family is yours. I will take my son and leave Portland. I hope you can forgive us." Patrick knew that he had to agree to give up his properties, as it was all he could do to save his son's life. Charlotte had been watching the scene play out in front of her in bewildered silence. But she was even more baffled by Patrick's acquiescence. As far as she knew, there weren't many of Luke's past mistakes that Patrick hadn't been able to fix with money, so she couldn't understand why he had given up so easily. But when she looked at Phil and then across at Estelle, she understood his reluctance Luke and Patrick were no match for a top figure in the criminal underworld, and someone with such financial power. Charlotte shook her head as she processed all that she had seen. She had never imagined that things would turn out like they had. After all, she had expected Patrick to arrive and put an end to the matter, but that was not what had happened. She just couldn't understand why everyone was afraid of Matthew. Luke looked at Charlotte, a ferocious expression clouding his features. He had come to hate that woman with every inch of his being. If it hadn't been for her, then he never would have gotten entangled with Matthew, and they wouldn't be in such a mess. Therefore, all his resentment was directed at her. His father had even agreed to leave his hometown to escape the calamity, and it was all because of her. Luke no longer looked at Charlotte with any desire. His heart was overflowing with endless regret, and he hated himself for taking fancy to such a woman.